right, good evening, First Baptist Church. What a crowd. All right, if y'all would stand, we are going to start this off with some worship songs. We're going to sing Victory in Jesus. I know you know the song, so let's sing it out.
Gave his life on Calvary Sing it out. 'cause heaven is our home. Through every storm, my soul will sing, Jesus is here. To God be the glory. Christ is enough for me. Christ is enough for me. Everything I need is in you. Everything I need. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. The cross before me, the world behind me. No turning back. No turning back. The cross before me, the world behind me. No turning back. No turning back. Singing Christ is enough for me. Christ is enough for me. Everything I need is in you. Everything I need, 'cause Christ is enough for me. Christ is enough for me. Everything I need is in you. Everything I need. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back. No turning back. Amen. You may be seated.
All right, good to see everybody here tonight. Turn in your Bibles this evening. We're in the book of Numbers as we continue our study. Tonight we're in Numbers chapter 30, so we're making good progress. Numbers chapter 30. If you're watching online, a few weeks back we had a little COVID challenge here at First Baptist Church, 2 or 3 weeks ago. That is all over now, and so you can come back to church now, okay? All right. We were down by 200 on Sunday. So, and what's funny is I know, and if you're watching online, church, that many of that 200 are rebels who say, I don't need a vaccine. There's no pandemic. So where were you Sunday? Of course, it is Sunday. It is summer, and people are on vacation. But be sure to come back this Sunday. Everybody's healthy. We still have just a couple of people we need to pray for that are struggling with health issues, and we'll get to that during the prayer time at the end. But other than that, everyone has recovered. Numbers chapter 30. I didn't advertise this, but I don't think she'll be too mad if I tell you. Most of you already know. On the day that we had the youth mission trip, or we were supposed to have the youth mission trip, a number of youth tested positive. That's when we first realized there was a problem. One of those who tested positive was my son Luke. And my wife had had a bad cough for several days, even though she's had both vaccines. And so I ran home and gave her a quick COVID test, and she tested positive too. So now everybody in my family has now had it. We have herd immunity. And again, I don't know who came up with that word herd, but so it's all good. Everybody's happy. Numbers chapter 30. We're going to begin in verse 1. We're going to look at chapters 30 and probably 31 tonight. It's a fascinating events that are happening. And before I read it, Moses is about to die. These are the last days of his life, literally, the last few things that God has him do before dying. They are on the east side of the Jordan, which is now the nation of Jordan. They have not crossed over into the Holy Land yet. Remember, God told Moses he would not be permitted to go with them into the Holy Land. So they're not there yet. And some interesting things are going to happen here before God calls Moses home and the rest of them, or the nation, goes across the river and begins to conquer the Holy Land. But Numbers chapter 30, so that's where we are. Finally, they're on the brink. Moses said to the heads of the tribes of Israel, "This is what the Lord commands. When a man makes a vow to the Lord or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he said. When a young woman still living in her father's house makes a vow to the Lord or obligates herself by a pledge, and her father hears about her vow or pledge but says nothing to her, then all her vows and every pledge by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her father forbids her, when he hears about it, none of her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. The Lord will release her because her father has forbidden her." Now, a lot of thoughts coming to my mind, but let me hold off. Verse 6, if she marries after she makes a vow or after her lips utter a rash promise by which she obligates herself, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her, then her vows or the pledges by which she has obligated herself will stand. But if her husband forbids her when he hears about it, he nullifies the vow that obligates her or the rash promise by which she obligates herself, and the Lord will release her. Any vow or obligation taken by a widow or divorced woman will be binding on her. In verse 10, if a woman living with her husband makes a vow or obligates herself by a pledge under oath, and her husband hears about it but says nothing to her and does not forbid her, then all her vows or the pledges by which she obligated herself will stand. But if her husband nullifies them, and when he hears about them, then none of the vows or pledges that came from her lips will stand. Her husband has nullified them, and the Lord will release her. Her husband may confirm or nullify any vow she makes or any sworn pledge to deny herself. But if her husband says nothing to her about it from day to day, then he confirms all of her vows or pledges binding on her. He confirms them by saying nothing to her when he hears about them. If, however, he nullifies them sometime after he hears about them, then he is responsible for her guilt. Verse 16, these are the regulations the Lord gave Moses concerning relationships between a man and his wife and between a father and his young daughter still living in the house. Now, before I get into this, do you have any comments or reactions from this? What comes to your mind? You don't have to say anything, but yes, Sharon.
There's safety there. So if someone is doing a pledge or a vow where you just kind of go, oh yeah, that sounds good, I'll do it. And the father or the husband says, you thought about that.
Right.
Then again, maybe not.
Yes. I find myself wishing that, it's interesting that's a one-way thing. It protects the ladies, but not really men. So men, if you and I say something stupid, there's no recourse there, which is probably more likely going to be the case. But that is interesting. In Leviticus chapter 27, Moses had touched on the subject of vows. We looked at that recently in terms of dedicating people and possessions to the Lord. But here, he deals with personal vows and how they are affected by relationships. The chapter makes it clear that the home is basic to the nation and that there must be authority and subordination in the home, and that truth is what binds a society together. And so that's how the home was built. And so God told them, listen, in all these areas, you need to see the home in this fashion. And basically, the primary responsibility for what happens in the home is on the father. It's on the husband. And if something bad happens, and in this case vows, then it's really on him to do something about it. And if nothing is done, the guilt falls on him. He's responsible. He's responsible for his family. I don't think that's old-fashioned or anti-feminist. I think a man should be responsible for his family, take responsibility. He could say, well, she said whatever she wants to say. I can't do anything about that teenage girl of mine. She wants to say whatever. Or I can't control my wife. No, he's responsible. Also notice here there is a difference between vows and oaths. Did you notice that? It mentions both vows and oaths, but both were considered to be inviolate. You can take it back. The vow was a promise to do a certain thing for the Lord, while the oath was a promise not to do a certain thing. Any man who made a vow or took an oath had to keep his word because what he said was unto the Lord, as the passage would say. When people forget that God hears what they say, then they're tempted to deceive, and lies cause the fabric of society to rip apart. So there are vows and there are oaths, and we're supposed to keep both. But there are foolish vows made by men, women, and children or youth, and there is at least some consideration of that in this passage. I touched on this or alluded to it, I think, several weeks back when we were in Leviticus chapter 27, but I do want to look at it more closely at what I think is probably the dumbest vow in history. This is Judges chapter 11. Would you turn to Judges with me? Chapter 11, we're going to look in verse 30. Judges chapter 11, verse 30. And we'll be in Judges, in hopefully 3 or 4 months. But if you'll look there with me, Judges chapter 11, look at verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Well, that's a stupid vow. First of all, again, God had forbid human sacrifice. Human sacrifice of your child or any other human was something that all of the pagan nations did with their false gods. It is not something that you did to the Lord. So it's a bad vow from the very beginning. And then verse 32, then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. He devastated 20 towns from Aor to the vicinity of Minnith, as far as Abel-Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his house his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter! You have brought me down, and I am devastated. I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. Now, that's a dumb vow. That's a bad vow. So just because you make a vow to God doesn't mean it's a good vow. It doesn't mean it's a vow that God would honor or want you to make. It also says you need to be very careful about what vows you make to God. I shared the gospel with somebody this week in my office. Someone came by and very sincere, individual. And I told him the same as I tell everybody before praying what we call prayer of salvation, praying to receive God and to surrender to him, to his lordship. That before you pray that prayer, that it's just words, it doesn't mean anything unless you're sincere, unless you mean it. And I caution them about just throwing out words to God and not giving it much thought. And I equated it, and every time I share the gospel, I try to do this before we pray that prayer. I equate it to marriage vows. That if you make a vow, and by the way, young people, and I know I've shared this before, engaged couples, before I conduct their wedding, I tell them, when I share those vows with you and you make those vows to each other, you need to mean it. And if you don't mean it, don't say it. Don't get up here and say for better for worse if you don't mean for better for worse. Don't get up here and lie to each other and lie before God. Mean it. And so I say, if you're going to pray to receive Christ as your Savior and you're going to surrender to his lordship, you better mean that. God knows. He doesn't care about, you can't trick God. You can't just throw things out there and think that God's going to go for it. He knows exactly what's in our hearts and what's in our mind. And so there's no point in saying it if we don't mean it, because we're just fooling ourselves at that point. So you need to make careful vows to your God. So anyway, Judges chapter 11 clearly tells us that there are bad vows that we can make. It's not the only, I could give you other examples, but I won't. But there are examples of people that have come to me over the years and have told me they've made a vow to God, and then they told me what the vow was, and I was horrified. Now, when the men in this passage, in this time, when the men made promises to God, they had to keep their promises, and nobody could annul them. But what about the women? Moses deals with the vows of single women at home, women formerly married, and married women. The basic principle that is that if the woman is under the authority of her father or husband, the father or husband had to approve the vow. He also had the power to cancel the vow. The single young woman at home, if her father hears the vow and says nothing, the vow must stand and the young lady must fulfill it. Not only is there power in words, but there's also power in silence. Dads, and frankly, in this day and age, moms and dads, parents, if you hear your family member, one of your kids, regardless of their age, say something very foolish and say that they're going to do something, you and I have an obligation, we're the parents, to go to them and say, I don't think that's a good idea. Don't say to yourself, well, that's a very foolish thing, but I'm not going to say anything. I don't want to cause trouble. Yeah, cause trouble. You're the parent. They need to know. They don't have the wisdom that you and I have. They need to hear from us. And so there's some responsibility in that. So if the father says nothing, then she's bound to keep the vow no matter how bad it is. Silence means consent in this passage. But if the father announces that he disapproves of the vow is canceled. If later she becomes engaged to be married and her fiancé knows about the vow and says nothing, then the vow stands even after they marry. But if he doesn't approve, the vow is annulled even if her father approves it. Isn't that interesting? So when they're engaged, the dad or the fiancé can object. And if the fiancé objects, even if the dad doesn't, the vow still doesn't stand. Now, for the widow and the divorcee, the Lord assumes that these women are experienced and mature and can make wise decisions, although age and experience aren't always a guarantee of wisdom. If they make promises to the Lord, these promises must be fulfilled. Moses doesn't explain what would happen if they married again. Since no special qualifications are given, we assume that their vows couldn't be canceled even by their new husbands. Written into this ruling are some important truths, not the least of which is the power of speech. To make a promise is to obligate oneself to the Lord, whether people realize this or not. The foundations of society today are eroding because of unkept promises, whether they are official contracts, marriage vows, or political pledges. How many political pledges are broken? Or words spoken on the witness stand. We expect the Lord to keep his promises, and he expects us to keep ours. Truth is the cement that holds society together. Jesus himself said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." All right, interesting passage. Any comments before we move on? Okay, all right. Numbers chapter 31, look in verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. After that, you will be gathered to your people." Well, that's some conversation right there. Moses, you got one thing left. You got one battle left. I assume that Moses really wants to get this right, since it's his last hurrah here. And God tells him point blank, as soon as this is done, you're going to be dying. Verse 3, so Moses said to the people, "Arm some of your men to go to war against the Midianites to carry out the Lord's vengeance on them. Send into battle 1,000 men from each of the tribes of Israel." So 12,000 men armed for battle, 1,000 from each tribe, were supplied from the clans of Israel. Moses sent them into battle, 1,000 from each tribe, along with Phinehas and son of Eleazar, the priest, who took him with articles from the sanctuary and the trumpets for signaling. They fought against Midian as the Lord commanded Moses and killed every man. Among their victims were, and again, if this was all made up, you wouldn't see these kinds of details. Among their victims were Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, and Reba, the 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, the son of Beor, with a sword. Remember, Balaam was that prophet who had the donkey and ended up being disobedient, and so he was killed as well. The Israelites captured the Midianite women and children and took all the Midianite herds, flocks, and goods as plunder. They burned all the towns where the Midianites had settled, as well as all of their camps. They took all the plunder and spoils, including the people and animals, and brought the captives' spoils and plunder to Moses and Eleazar the priest and the Israelite assembly at their camp on the plain of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. So this was quite a battle. Though the people of Israel were wrong in getting entangled with the Midianites at Baal Peor, and we looked at that, Midian was wrong in following Balaam's counsel and trying to destroy Israel. So they had tried to destroy Israel, and so it is right and just that God would destroy them. Of course, he created them. He can do what he wants. Those who curse Israel, God will curse, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. And the time had come for God to punish Midian. This battle would be a dress rehearsal for the battles Israel would fight in the land of Canaan. Notice they're not in the land of Canaan yet. They're just on the other side of the river. So this is a trial. This is a practice run for what's going to take place when they get into the Holy Land. But this would be Moses' last battle. Then he would meet the last enemy, which is death. The battle was a monumental victory from the Lord, for all the Midianite men were killed, but not one single Jewish soldier died. Now that's a pretty good battle, is it not? 100% victory, 100-0. Many enemy leaders were killed during the battle, and after the battle, Joshua killed 5 remaining Midianite kings, and I read them to you. Balaam, the architect of the great seduction at Baal Peor, was also killed, and Israel burned the cities and claimed the Midianite territory, later giving it to the tribe of Reuben. Now, verse 13, Moses, Eleazar, the priest, and all the leaders of the community went to meet them outside the camp. Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds who returned from the battle. Again, this is his last thing he's going to do. They have this amazing victory. Didn't lose one guy. Complete victory. They go back, they're celebrating. Woo! It's time for the pep rally. And Moses is mad. Why was he mad? Well, let's find out. It sounds bizarre. Verse 15, "Have you allowed all the women to live?" he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and were the means of turning the Israelites away from the Lord in what happened at Peor, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who's never slept with a man. So if you remember the story, this is when they realized they weren't going to win militarily, the way that they decided to defeat Israel was to seduce them into sin. So the women, the Midianite women, came to the men and, kind of on date night, I guess is what it was. And they said, hey, come to worship service with us. And they said, oh, okay. If that's how they do date night, I'll do that. So they went to the worship service. And of course, when you worship Baal, what do? Well, there's some hanky-panky going on, and they all got naked and did their thing. It was for worship. So these women led these men into sin. Now, the men were judged as well, but it's time for judgment upon the Midianites for their behavior, and specifically these women. So the men didn't kill the very women that led them into sin. The men didn't kill them. And Moses, of course, he's 120. He's thinking a little more clearly than these men. And there's probably no doubt the men had plans for these women. And ultimately, Moses knows if they end up coupling with these women worship false gods, and the whole nation is going to go down the tubes. And so Moses is really thinking about the purity of his people, of his nation. And verse 19, all of you who have killed anyone or touched anyone who was killed must stay outside the camp 7 days. And that was regulation. That was the law. On the 3rd and 7th days, you must purify yourselves and your captives. Purify every garment, as well as everything made of leather, goat hair, or wood. Then Eleazar the priest said to the soldiers who had gone into the battle, this is the requirement of the law that the Lord gave Moses. Gold, silver, bronze, iron, tin, lead, and anything else that can withstand fire must be put through the fire, and then it will be clean. But it must also be purified with the water of cleansing, and whatever cannot withstand fire must be put through the water. On the 7th day, wash your clothes, and you will be clean. Then you may come into the camp. And when you were pronounced unclean, it was always 7 days before you could be considered clean again. And they were pronounced unclean because if you come into contact with a dead body, you're unclean. And so in the middle of battle, there's a lot of dead bodies. And so this would have been prescribed no matter what. Verse 25, the Lord said to Moses, you and Eleazar the priest and the family heads of the community are to count all the people and animals that were captured. Divide the spoils between the soldiers who took part in the battle and the rest of the community. From the soldiers who fought in the battle, set apart a tribute for the Lord, 1 out of every 500, whether persons, cattle, donkeys, sheep, or goats. Take this tribute from their half share and give it to Eleazar, priest, as the Lord's part. From the Israelites' half, select 1 out of every 50, whether persons, cattle, donkeys, sheep, goats, or other animals. Give them to the Levites, who are responsible for the care of the Lord's tabernacle. So Moses and Eleazar the priest did as the Lord commanded Moses. The plunder remaining from the spoils that the soldiers took was 675,000 sheep. That's a lot of sheep. 72,000 head of cattle, 61,000 donkeys. That's a lot of donkeys. And 32,000 women who had never slept with a man. So they said, you go and keep the women who have not slept with men, and because they were innocent, and so they divided them. The people and animals that Israel took as spoils of war were distributed 3 ways. The soldiers got half, the people in the camp got half, and both the soldiers and the people gave a percentage to the Lord. After all, it was God who gave them the victory. So that's how it was divided up, interestingly. So that's how they did that. All right, I'm going to look in if you'll skip down to verse 48. Then the officers who were over the units of the army, the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, went to Moses and said to him, your servants have counted the soldiers under your command, and not one is missing. So we have brought as an offering to the Lord the gold articles each of us acquired, armlets, bracelets, signet rings, earrings, and necklaces to make atonement for ourselves before the Lord. Moses and Eleazar the priests accepted from them the gold, and all the crafted articles, all the gold from the commanders of the thousands, the commanders of hundreds that Moses and Eleazar presented as a gift to the Lord, weighed 16,750 shekels. Each soldier had taken plunder for himself. Moses and Eleazar the priest accepted the gold from the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds and brought it into the tent of meeting as a memorial for the Israelites before the Lord. Now this is actually a nice passage. It was above and beyond what they needed to do. There was appreciation on the part of the men, the soldiers, over the fact that they didn't lose anybody. Now, these guys had been enough skirmishes to know that when you go into battle, even if you win the battle, you're still going to lose some men. It just doesn't work this way, 100 to nothing. And so they're very aware that God gave them an amazing, miraculous victory, and so they want to bless God back. When the officers spoke of making atonement, by the way, for themselves to the Lord, they weren't suggesting that the gift of gold could in any way save their souls. According to Exodus chapter 30, verse 11, each time there was a census in Israel, the men 20 years old and older were to each give a half shekel of silver as an offering to the Lord. This was known as atonement money and was originally used to make the sockets for the posts that helped to form the tabernacle frame. Realizing that their lives had been graciously spared, the 12,000 soldiers wanted to give extra atonement, sacrificial offering, and thanksgiving to the Lord. Instead of bringing silver, they brought over 400 pounds of gold, which Moses and Eleazar received and put into the sanctuary. So that's chapter 31. Different from chapter 30, but same battle. All right, are we doing okay? All right, I'm going to begin chapter 32, and then we'll look at our prayer list for the week. Chapter 32, verse 1. The Reubenites and Gadites, who had very large herds and flocks, saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were suitable for livestock. So they came to Moses and Eleazar the priest and to the leaders of the community and said, Atarath, Dabin, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Eliel, Zebim, Nebo, and beyond, the land the Lord subdued before the people of Israel are suitable for livestock, and your servants have livestock. If we have found favor in your eyes, they said, let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan. So the Reubenites and the Gadites, this is two of the tribes. They're looking around, and they haven't even gone into the Holy Land yet. But they're on the east side of the Jordan. It's near the Jordan, and it's decent land. And they have all this livestock. And so they think to themselves, hey, what's wrong with this land? We just defeated the people that lived here. We burned all their towns. I think we'll just stay here. There's no need to go across the river. We just stay here. And so they go to Moses. Now, they should have waited till Moses died. But they didn't. Verse 6. Now, by the way, what's wrong with that plan? They're going to bail. They're going to build up their towns there. And then now it's 10 tribes having to face all of the enemy on the other side of the river. And so it's a bad plan. Verse 6, Moses said to the Gadites and Reubenites, so your countrymen go to war while you sit here? Why do you discourage the Israelites from going over into the land the Lord has given them? This is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to look over the land. After they went up to the valley of Eshcol and viewed the land, they discouraged the Israelites from entering the land the Lord had given them. The Lord's anger was aroused that day, and he swore this oath, because they have not followed me wholeheartedly. Not one of the men, 20 years old or older, who came up out of Egypt will see the land I promised on oath to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not one except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, and Joshua, son of Nun, for they followed the Lord wholeheartedly. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander into the desert for 40 years until the whole generation of those who had done evil in his sight was gone. So here's why, again, how do you argue with Moses? You know, again, he's 120. This may be his last argument. And he says, what are you talking about? You guys are doing the same thing again that your parents did. Don't you know anything? We got to the brink of the Holy Land. We could see it over there on the horizon. And then this report came, oh, we can't go into the Holy Land. And so they're finally there 40 years later. They look over into the Holy Land, and here's 2 tribes already saying, hey, I think we'll just stay here. And he doesn't take that very well. And so he compares them to their sinful forefathers. And so they, let me read verse 14. He gets more direct. And here you are, a brood of sinners, standing in the place of your fathers and making the Lord even more angry with Israel. If you turn away from following him, he will again leave all this people in the desert, and you will be the cause of their destruction. Ooh, that's a heavy burden there. And I can only assume they're standing there going, whoa, wait, no, we don't want to be at fault. So they clarify. I think that's what we say in our government. They clarify their intent. Verse 16, then they came up to him and said, we would like to build pens here for our livestock and cities for our women and children. But we are ready to arm ourselves and go ahead of the Israelites until we have brought them into their place. Meanwhile, our women and children will live in fortified cities for protection from the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every Israelite has received his inheritance. We will not receive any inheritance with them on the other side of the Jordan, because our inheritance has come to us on the east side of the Jordan. Then Moses said to them, if you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before the Lord for battle, and if all of you will go armed over the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven his enemies out before him, then when this land is subdued before the Lord, you may return and be free from your obligation to the Lord and to Israel. And this land will be your possession before the Lord. And basically Moses says, okay, if you'll do that, fair enough. Verse 23, but if you fail to do this, you will be sinning against the Lord, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out. Build cities for your women and children, and pens for your flocks, but do what you have promised. Wow, I just find that interesting. Now the result is, you can guess, I don't know how long it takes to build a fortified city and pens for that much livestock, but the nation lingered long enough for the 2.5 tribes to move into their land, defeat the enemies who remained, and get their families and their flocks settled safely. This one commentary says this, but we can't help but wondering if these tribes made a wise choice. They were outside the land of promise, and they separated from the rest of the nation. They made their choice only on the basis of personal gain. The land was good for their flocks and herds. Like Lot, they were walking by sight and not by faith, because in fact, that was not part of the Holy Land. Had they not said that, they would have gone into the promised land and they would have inherited land there. But they didn't get to do that because they settled for land on the other side of the Jordan. It was good enough for them. I can sympathize with that. Good enough is often, or at least sometimes, sufficient for us. God has plans for us. We settle for something less. All right, any comments before we conclude? All right, that concludes our Bible study time. If you'll take your prayer sheet, and we'll go over our prayer.